My name is Bill Josephsen and I'm a Queensland medical graduate, and I've worked for many years in hospitals across Western Queensland and also at Halls Creek in the Kimberleys. I've worked in various positions of medical officer, senior medical officer, superintendent with right of private practice, and also deputy superintendent of a larger hospital. But I spent a good deal of time at Halls Creek, and my wife and I enjoyed it very much. It was an action-packed job, 24/7. We had one weekend off a month, and we used to go 700 k's down to Broome to enjoy it. But the time there was quite remarkable, very, very busy. Most of the time I was on my own. There were two doctors that were there for part of the time. One of the doctors was Derek, who came via South Africa, but from Zambia. And he and I became friends very quickly. He was perfect fit for Halls Creek. He was excellent at trauma, having been in Soweto. He was an actual gem. And his family, they were Christians. He was a lovely man. His wife was a lovely woman. His children were beautiful children with beautiful white teeth. And he had skills that I didn't have. He was the best person. Really, one of our biggest problems was babies, dehydrated, anemic, underweight and infected, often with parasites. They needed intravenous management. It was very difficult for people like me. You had to have 6 people hold the child down and often have 2 or 3 goes. Derek had a technique for solving that problem. He would have the mother stand up, hold the baby to her chest, put the baby's arms around her neck, and let the baby rest its head on her shoulder. Derek would stand beside her, put a rubber band or a tourniquet around the child's head above the eyes, and insert a butterfly cannula straight into that vein running down the forehead, called the frontal vein or supraorbital vein, I think. He would get it right every time, and the child would stay totally quiet, often asleep. He was magic. The only ever time I saw Derek in any way distressed is we were having dinner with his wife and my wife at the best restaurant in Halls Creek, which is a motel. And halfway through, he was on call, the phone rang, and his face went several shades whiter. He blanched. A smile comes to my face thinking about it. He said, "There's been a stabbing up at the hospital. It's gone very close to the aorta. There's blood everywhere." So I said, "I'll go with you." We went up, and indeed that was true. There was blood everywhere, on every wall. The guy was drunk. But luckily together we were able to get an artery forceps on the bleeder, which was not the aorta, it was coming off the aorta. It was a bleeder, and we stopped it and ligatured it. And we just went back to dinner and left the nursing staff to fix it up, clean up the thing, and just put in a few sutures around it. That was the only time I ever saw him in any way, in any degree, rattled. He only had one problem, and that problem was that he was black, as black can be. And you can call it reverse racism. His children were bullied, bullied and beaten. His wife was yelled at in the street, and he was constantly underrated by the locals. they would come to me and say, I want to see him, he's black. And unfortunately, Derek had to stay 3 months to get his entitlements, but after 3 months he left. He went to Port Hedland, stayed there a while. It was a pretty dingy place, and ended up got a job in Alberta in Canada, and I lost touch with him, but he was a terrific guy. The other doctor at the end came. Her name was Pam. She was younger, gregarious, charming, not interested in the flights to Balgo, Billyluna and Mullen, which came with the job, but I liked doing that, so I did nearly all of that. Pam was gregarious and very charming, got on very well with the ladies. And that brings me to another case involving, which was a tragic case, and ultimately I guess I bear the responsibility for most of it. A young girl came in with a headache, and it was a severe headache, and it was central. She had no signs, but she came from a domestic violence background, and we wondered whether she'd been assaulted or hit in the head. We all approached her, Pam and myself, as well as the nurses. We even got a policewoman to come up in civilian gear, but as a policewoman, and say if there had been trauma, there would be no charges. She absolutely refused to say whether there was any trauma. Her partner actually had been in jail for domestic violence, and she was under considerable pressure from families, I guess insurmountable pressure from families to not admit to trauma. So she was given a pethidine injection, the pain went away, and she went to sleep. We had concerns, to put it mildly. I rang RFDS. An RFDS flight from Derby to Halls Creek to Perth and back to Derby again cost $20,000. RFDS, a very wonderful organisation, but they didn't want to get involved without a history of trauma, and we didn't have that. So we waited, and the next morning she woke up, the pain came back, and she suddenly died. She had a fixed dilated pupil and died on the spot. Ultimately, it came out that there was trauma. He had punched her a few times in the head. Charges were preferred, and he did go to jail, but she lost her life. To us, it emphasised the power and the control of the family, which is overwhelming. It was unbelievable. Which reminds me of another similar case of a 12-year-old girl who was being repeatedly raped by her uncle. She went to the social worker first, spoke to the social worker about it. The social worker spoke to me, and she was quite forthright. The police were notified. The police charged the gentleman, who was her uncle, and we thought all well and good, but when the time came to appear before the magistrate, she refused to appear, refused to give a statement, and the whole case fell apart. The uncle who was doing the raping did get some kind of reprimand, but it was not really in keeping with what was going on. Another example of the huge family pressure. She was told that if she dobbed her uncle in, she would be excluded from the family, or I forget the right word, but excluded from the family. So there we go. But anyway, at Balgo, involved flights to, at Halls Creek, it involved flights to Balgo, Billyluna and Mullen on frequent occasions. Balgo every week. If we could do Mullen and Billy Luna once a week we could, but usually they were every second week. And the flight from Halls Creek to those communities usually took between 1.5 to 2 hours, depending on headwinds. It was in a Cessna 310 twin-engine plane with 4 seats. And they were really a lovely time for me. I enjoyed it very much. But it brings me to a story. The story relates to His Royal Highness, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, who was in Cairns in 2002, presenting awards for the Duke of Edinburgh Fellowship, and he was presented with a ceremonial spear. Rather naively but innocently, the Duke asked, "Do you gentlemen ever use these spears to settle your differences?" Now this was anathema. He was roundly criticised everywhere by the media, the newspapers, the radio and all that stuff. How naive was this gentleman to suggest such a thing? Well, my part of the story is the day before I'd been to Balgo and everything went well except one situation. There was a sick child, just less than a year old, but otherwise healthy, who had pneumonia. The girl had fever, sore throat, cough, crepitations at both bases. She had bronchopneumonia. She needed intravenous antibiotics. The relatively simple situation. At the end of the clinic, the pilot, the nurse and myself jumped in the back of a troopie which had open sides, and we drove down to the house to pick up the mother, who was 17-year-old, but the mother refused to go, and there was a violent argument with screaming going on in the family, outside the house. There was the grandmother and grandfather, mother and father, the young girl who was 17 and her partner. They were screaming at each other at a very high pitch. We stood there and listened. Ultimately, the girl and her boyfriend ran around the other side of the troopie, and she picked up a rock and threw it at her grandmother, which hit her, knocked her grandmother down, but didn't hurt her grandmother. The rocks came back and they started throwing rocks over the top of the troopie, which was kind of humorous to us inside the troopie because we felt perfectly safe. We just looked at each other with our mouths agape. And this went on for a while, and then the grandfather went into the house and came out with 3 real spears and distributed them to the males, and they started throwing the spears over the top of the troopie at the others. And wasn't really, the troopie was in between. I don't think it was very dangerous, but the spears were going back and forth, left, right and centre for about 5 minutes. Ultimately, the driver of the car, who was a full-grown male, respected in the community, got out of the vehicle, went around to the girl and punched her in the face. She fell to the ground, soon got up. He then came back to the troopie and said, "Doc, I apologise, she's my sister." Yuck. So the whole thing quietened down. It was decided that the grandmother would take the baby in the spare seat back to Halls Creek. The grandmother was very happy with this because she'd never been in a plane before, so the grandmother carried the baby in the spare seat in the Cessna 310 back to Halls Creek. The baby was treated with intravenous antibiotics and made an excellent recovery. On about the beginning of the 3rd day, the whole family turned up and they were spotless, all smiles, no rancour. They picked the baby up and disappeared. Very good ending for them. Only problem is HRH never got any kind of apology. I did ring the Australian newspaper, which was delivered a day late in Halls Creek, but they weren't interested. Oh, there you go. Talking about babies, I've got another story of a baby left on the side of the road just north of Halls Creek. The parents were drinking very heavily, cheap flagon wine, and they both had primary syphilis, but they were blind drunk most of the time. The lady delivered of a baby and placenta on the side of the road, and they thought the baby was dead. So they just left the baby there in the dirt. Another passenger came by, and another person came by and picked the baby up, rushed the baby to the hospital, which caused considerable consternation, but we were a bit used to consternation. The baby had to be cleaned up, warmed up, fed, and given oxygen. So the baby remained alive. I rang RFDS in Derby, and they said, okay, we'll come up. If the baby's still alive when we get there, we'll take the baby down to Princess Margaret Hospital in Perth. The police, meantime, had picked up the couple, put them in jail. RFDS turned up, they picked the baby up, took the baby to Princess Margaret Hospital in Perth, and that was the last we heard for a while, except we knew the baby had survived. Close to a year later, we got a call, the baby's ready to come back to Halls Creek, it's been total recovery. The baby did so. By that time, the parents had their syphilis treated, they'd been dried out, they'd totally reformed, and were, what do you call it? A-grade citizens, so to think. And, you know, the baby then returned to them, they got the baby back, and they lived happily ever after. If there was a story, it's unbelievable, but that's what happened. It was a happy ending. So, other stories not quite so happy ending. One was in southwest, talking of babies, southeast Queensland. I was medical superintendent there. This was quite a few years ago. When an Aboriginal couple turned up, they were very well dressed, very polite. They stated to the nurse, we have to go walkabout. We would like to leave our baby here for a few months, but we will come back. The nurse said, oh, you can't do that, it's against the law and regulation. They said, well, we really have to do that. We have to go and walk about. The matron came out and she was very formidable. She argued that this was impossible in various terms. However, the couple were adamant and they just put the baby down and left. I was not there at the time, I was at the surgery, but I soon got to know the baby because the hospital looked after the baby for 12 months. After 12 months, the parents not returning, the baby was subject to discussion at the board meeting of the hospital, and that's all the VIPs from the district, and it was decided that the baby be fostered and adopted, which did occur. There was no ramifications. So that's that particular story. On the other side of the ledger, there's some that didn't turn out quite so well. One involved a senior nurse at Balgo, who was a registered nurse in her late 40s, not unduly glamorous, but not I don't know what you'd say, not unduly glamorous, but quite a healthy individual lady who was a senior at Balgo. She was a person who respected and loved the Aborigines more than any of us. They could do no wrong. Her whole life was built around serving them. One night at 10 o'clock, she received a call from one of the people she knew and liked. He was 8 kilometres from Balgo and his car had broken down, and would she come and pick him up? This is against regulations. You were not supposed to leave the perimeter after hours, but she overrode this and said that she would go out and pick the person up. She was advised not to do so, but she did. The next morning she returned in a dishevelled state. She'd obviously been in the dirt. No visible bruises, but very upset. She She picked up her belongings from Balgo, got back to Halls Creek and got the first plane out, didn't bother to put in any resignation, didn't bother to sort out her pay or anything like that. She just walked away from the place and returned to her family in Melbourne. Everyone knew the story. She'd been raped, and the question was by how many? And she had elected to stay alive and provide minimal resistance, I presume. We don't really know, but she did survive, and I guess no one will ever really know the story. The car subsequently turned up in the Northern Territory about 1,000 miles away. So that was a rather unfortunate story. As a remark, I would like to comment that whilst we were there, the West Australian government introduced teaching Aboriginal languages to the school kids. I think it had been tried some time before, but it was definitely in absence when I started there, and it did start again while I was there. They were paying people to teach the Aboriginal kids their language. And initially we thought this was a pretty good idea, but it turned very sour very quickly because the Aboriginal pidgin languages started developing. Kids were becoming truant and becoming dysfunctional. And it soon became evident that really the majority of people couldn't do both languages together. And English can get you everywhere, and Aboriginal languages can get you nowhere. If you can be proficient at both, fair enough, but the majority of young kids couldn't, and their schooling suffered.